All right, so here we go for tonight. So what do we mean by the sociology of terrorism? Is what we want to know is from a top-down or a bottom-up process, what creates a situation for individuals and groups to terrorize, if we condense the word terrorism, another group of individuals. So we're going to start down this road, starting with some definitions. And I like to start with this quote by Dostoevsky. While nothing is easier than to denounce the evildoer, nothing is more difficult than to understand them. And what is really meant by this statement is that sometimes it's really easy just to say that person is evil and they're doing wrong. But it's much harder to understand why, in the first place, they're doing these actions, because they just a lot of times don't make sense to us and to our minds. So this is kind of where we're heading in this lecture. So let's start with terrorism and the United States. So I kind of disagree with this slide, because I don't think the first, we need to talk about incidences before 9/11 and since 9/11, because for some reason in the United States, we have this idea that terrorism started with 9/11. And that's when we started ramping up security. That's when we started ramping up people in the United States having to carry papers to prove their nationality and where they came from. And so we need to talk about the incidences before and after 9/11, because as we'll see, that while 9/11 was a critical point, because it was a foreign group coming in and doing acts of terrorism, they're not the start of terrorism in the United States. And we need to talk then about our reactive nature to it, okay? Difficulties in compliance and analysis of intel. We'll look at that a little bit. We need to look at outside sources of hostile, insurance of the enemy, and focus on religious extremists. I just want to make this point before we start on the religious extremists, okay, is that most people who do acts of terrorism, whether it's domestic terrorism or it's foreign terrorism, do not start with religion as their basis for hatred. They use religion to reinforce their hatred, and they make the doctrine fit it. And I just want to bring that out right from the beginning as we begin this conversation. So how are we going to analyze this? Well, we need to look at the top-down versus bottom-up processes. So the top-down are what systems are in place that allow terrorist groups to develop. What conditions are necessary for a terrorist group to begin? And then when we talk about bottom-up processes, we got to talk about the individual. What is it about the individual that creates the terrorist? And probably from this perspective, it comes from a very interesting analysis of people who strap bombs to their body and walk into a mosque or a coffee shop and blow themselves up, okay? When we look at these individuals, we assume that they are lost individuals who don't have a place, or they can't, or they're just susceptible victims to ideology. Yet analysis of over 900 bombers that had survived indicate that the majority of them are college educated. A good number of them are engineers. They have healthy, intact families. They have healthy, intact, intimate relationships with their partners, and they're well respected in their community. And this is why we need to look at the bottom-up processes, is the people who are committing terrorism are not people who are rejected by society or rejected by their community. For the most part, they are well-to-do individuals that are educated, have strong, healthy families. But what we do know about them is they want to leave their mark. They want to leave their name for their family and for their future. And so we need to talk about these bottom-up processes as we talk about why do people terrorism. And the reason I'm using terrorism is because it encompasses things like hate crimes. It encompasses things like gender and ethnicity crimes. So I'm just putting that out there. Justifications for, we need to look at the justifications for terrorism. So justify when aimed at bad people. Okay, so if you look at the propaganda of Al-Qaeda and those organizations, they draw a picture of citizens in the United States, of the Western world, as being these devil-type people that are here to destroy humanity. So it's a moral justification. And then we have to look at the dehumanization process. Dehumanization is when you give people less than a human status. You make them look like that they're animals or less than human. Okay, and what we see is, and we could look at it propaganda during wars, we could look at it propaganda from terrorist groups, is dehumanization. They make their enemy look like they're animal-like, that they're less than human, they're barbaric, okay? Which, interesting, the word barbarian actually comes from a Greek word that when Greeks came across foreigners they couldn't understand, especially in the northern areas of Europe, that their language sounded like ba, 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 ba. And so they started to call those individuals the barbarians because of the language it sounded like. It was never meant to be a derogatory term, but it became a derogatory term as those other people we don't understand that are less than human than us, okay? And then when we look at crazy criminals and the crusade, crazies, emotionally disturbed individuals commit these kind of crimes. Criminals perform acts of personal gain, and crusaders for prestige and power. But again, when we look at those who commit acts of terrorism, we see that they are individuals who are, again, well-to-do, those people that we often look up to, those people that are college educated, all of those things. And so we have to question, when we look at terrorist group, when we look at those individuals, are they really crazy criminals and crusaders? So we'll look at that. And I just saw Angel's comment, yes, it does sound very much like the JFK situation, right? And so we'll take a closer look at that. So let's first talk about defining terrorism, and let's give it a little bit more definition. And we're going to start with the FBI's definition. The FBI defines a terrorist as anyone who unlawful use of force or violence against a person and property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political and social objectives, okay? May publicize, dramatize, further political or religiously motivate and justify political and social agenda. So when we're talking about terrorists, we're talking about either individuals or groups who want people to accept their ideology, but they do it through violence, force, and intimidation. Okay. So let's talk a minute about who and what. Okay, what is the social constructs? What are the perceptions? Terrorism as political violence. So we'll talk about relative affluence. And the one thing that we always need to talk about in this section is history of colonialist exploitation. Because when we look at especially foreign terrorist groups, they often grow out of colonialism. Okay. And especially when we look at the Middle East, when we look in Turkey, when we look in Asiatic countries, when we look in the African continent, all of those countries that were exploited create this type of potential violence. Okay. Terrorism as communication. So we need to look at how terrorist groups use media to determine their legitimacy. And socializing terrorists, acceptance of action, exposure equals commitment. And this is a socialization process for a terrorist. Okay, so we'll take a look at these variables. So let's first look at the stages that lead to terrorism. Okay, one, we start with a crisis of confidence. Okay, what does that mean? Crisis of confidence. Okay, let's break that down. One, crisis is that there's some thing that is impeding or preventing in a legitimate way to the individual that something is happening. Confidence is that that crisis is something real, that it belongs. Okay. This makes the conflict of legitimization. So when you have the idea that a crisis, even though it's happening on either the individual or group level, and you have confidence that you're in the right mind, you're in the right position, that legitimizes a conflict. And this is what creates what is called the crisis of legitimacy. Grievances turn into intense hate of the enemy, and this starts the dehumanization process. People stop being less than human to the person who feels that they have a legitimate crisis that is being caused by another group. Okay, as this quote says, once the enemy had been declared and made into absolute moral evil, the world became simple, and any means were justified for fighting this evil. And this brings down these three C's: crisis of confidence, conflict of legitimacy, and crisis of legitimacy. When we start to see the other side as nothing more than a dehumanized population. And so let's talk about this. Understanding the individual who commits terrorism is vital, not only for humanitarian reasons, but also to decide how to best deal with the individuals which, while they are engaged in planning and carrying out terrorist acts. And this is where we're going. Okay, so let's talk now about what is called the terrorist mindset. The way we can summarize this following slide, and I'll just read it really quick, may sway how they interpret and respond to situations, can be drivers and products of psychological propensities, may increase receptivity to extremist ideology or justification for violence, may not cause terrorism, can create or enable vulnerability and propensity for affiliation. So what does this really mean? As I mentioned, many terrorists, especially the bombers, are not individuals who are disadvantaged in this world. But what they are is looking for their purpose, looking for their family and where their family belongs in this system, in this world, that can be viewed as this constant pull and push of my own ideologies versus everyone else's. And what better way to show my family strength, to show my own purpose, to show my historic line that my ideology, and as an extension, my family's ideology, was always right, was always the way it was supposed to be. If we think about that, that's what has created the myths of heroes. If you really think about that, if you go back to Greek ideology, Greek history, they had stories about these great men, quote unquote, who went out to prove themselves, to say, my ideas of the world are the right ways of the world. And anyone who does not meet that ideology is my enemy. And then this justifies things like violence and extremist ideology. Now, this may not cause terrorism. In some cases, it might, I'll fully admit this, it reminds me of one of my uncles who has a very extremist ideologist. So he has this little homestead. He has barbed wire around his fence. There's rumors that he's laid mines. There's guns everywhere. But that may not culminate into him becoming someone who will enact violence and create fear among a population. But what it does do is it protects his world, that encapsulated world. And in some cases, like we see in northern Idaho with the skinheads and the white supremacists who live in that very isolated area in the northern tip of panhandle of Idaho, that's kind of what we see. They're really kind of harmless unless, and this is the issue, unless they are called to action. And that's what makes groups like that more dangerous. Can create or enable vulnerability and propensity for affiliation. So once they start feeling that vulnerability towards their groups, that may cause that group to then enact action against others. And then we have to look at what type of worldviews affect the mindset of especially those who would be susceptible to domestic terrorisms, hate crimes, and terrorism around the world. And there's really kind of three things. And then we're going to get into one big one, which is called fundamentalism. But these three kind of start off the process. One is authoritarianism, and that's submission to an authority. Staunch conventionalism, anger and aggression towards an outgroup. Individuals who are domestic terrorists, those who commit hate crimes, those white supremacists, those individuals that they're very authoritarian mindset, meaning that they will follow a leader to the end. They believe that there is an authority hierarchy in this world, and their group is sitting at the top. And that anger and aggression towards those outgroups who do not obey that authoritarian mindset are a danger. And so it can create anger and aggression towards those groups. Dogmatism affects a person's appraisal of injustice, closed cognitive systems or beliefs about reality. dogmatism, in a little while, we're going to get to psychological aspects of people who enter into these types of groups, is that it's very black and white thinking, okay? For these kind of individuals, for example, if they're a Christian extremist, there is no good about being a Muslim or an atheist or a Buddhist, okay? If they're on that extreme level of dogmatic thinking, that the Christian thinking is the only way of thinking, then they're closed to any other type of belief system that is available. And I always bring this up. It's like when you're arguing with someone on Facebook and they tend to have a very extreme perspective. Has everyone ever noticed you never change their mind? And that the more you argue with them, the more angry they become and the less human you become. You become this idiot. You become this less than human. You become this other person, even though they don't even know you. Because as that dogmatic view gets challenged, they become thicker and thicker and thicker and more entrenched into their belief system. The other thing we see, especially among white extremists here in the United States and extremist groups, but also among other terrorist groups, is this apocalyptic view. That the view that if things aren't straightened out, we're in the end of times. And that we need to protect ourselves because the end of times is coming. So when we look at it from the Jewish or the Catholic or the Christian view, for the Catholic and Christians, the second coming is coming. And judgment day is coming. And we got to protect this view. In the Jewish faith, we see this idea that the world is going to come to an end and the first coming is but it's still going to be apocalyptic. When we look at it from the Muslim perspective, the extreme, and please don't get me wrong, if you're any part of these faith is, I'm talking about the extremist perspective. Those people who say that the end is coming and there's nothing we can do to avoid it. Okay. And so I just want to bring this up, especially among religious extremists. This tends to be the thing that we see. Now we need to talk about fundamentalism, okay? And when we talk about fundamentalism, it's individuals who have a very fundamental view of the world. And there's 5 primary characteristics, and they sound very familiar to the list we had before, but these are very individualistic views. So in the other view, it's kind of a group view that the end is coming. It's kind of one of those views that, oh no, this is an individual perspective. Okay, and so let's first look at dualistic thinking. This is a tendency to form absolute ideas about nature of right and wrong and how events fall into one category or the other. Okay, this is, if you've taken a developmental class or in Psych 101, and we talked about Piagetian theory, and we talked about individuals who are in the concrete operational phase of development. The reason it's called concrete is people think very black and white. There's cops, there's robbers. There's good, there's evil. There's black, there's white. And this very dualistic perspective makes it so that there cannot be any good qualities of that other person, hence the dehumanization process. The other aspect of fundamentalism is paranoia. In a group context, extreme and unwarranted suspiciousness associated with hypersensitivity to humiliation and threats to self-esteem. And this is what we have seen with many white supremacists, especially over about the last 5-10 years, as here in the United States, as the white population has started to shrink and the minority population has started to grow, there has created this paranoia among many of these individuals that their country is being taken over, that America is not America, patriots are not being patriots because they're speaking different languages, they look different colors, they don't act the same as I do. And that becomes a threat to one's self-esteem, that they're trying to change the definition of what it means to be, and I need to correct this term, not American, but a white American, which has dominated the United States culture for about the last 300-400 years, especially here in the United States. And that threat creates a hypersensitivity, a paranoia that, quote unquote, Mexicans are coming across the borders and taking all of our jobs. Asians are coming over here and bringing disease and those types of stuff. Muslims are coming over and trying to take over our religions and all those kinds of things. And that's one of the other components of this fundamentalist idea. On the next level is the apocalyptic orientation, narratives of personal and global history. And this is where individuals use what they think they know about human history. They apply it to their personal narrative and state, for example, a white person saying the United States is going to hell in a handbag because there's more women in Congress, there's more ethnic minorities in government, there's more individuals at my grocery store that look different than I do. And based on global history, their interpretation of global history, that then creates this apocalyptic orientation that the world is ending and something needs to be done. The next level is relationship with a charismatic leadership. Group centers on a leader with powerful presence who is often paranoid themselves, but shows complete assurance and intense conviction of his or her ideas. I don't want to insult any Republicans in this class. And I do know that even on the left hand, there's individuals like this. But there is an individual that is in that Republican right-wing sector that believes they have all of these qualities. And because of that, it created one of America's greatest threats on January 6th, a couple years ago, because of a powerful leader who is very paranoid, but seems very self-assured and has an intense conviction that they are the right person. Okay, you take that and you add it to dualistic thinking, black and white, paranoia, apocalyptic, and you're getting the conjoinals of not only cultic behavior, but also of terroristic behaviors, which we saw on January 6th of 2001. Totalized conversion experience. This is when a person finds that group with that leader and they feel revitalized. They feel like they found their place, they found their home, and in a sense, they found their peace. And that anything that threatens that needs to be dealt with. Okay, this is the fundamentalism of terrorism. Okay, and I did see a question up here. How do we reverse these things? Angel, I hope we'll get to that tonight. We're trying to get to how these groups are actually involved. But I'm hoping by the end, we'll look at some ways that maybe we can do what's called deprogramming. So I do want to talk about some changes in the face of terror, especially here in the United States, is that previously terrorism, and I kind of disagree with this statement because there's been groups that have been terrorized internally here in the United States since its founding. We can talk about Black people and Black slavery. We can talk about the Native American apocalypse. And the destruction of Native American communities. But I think this slide is trying to take it from a nationalist view, but it says that terrorism used to be just previously seen as an external enemy. And I think that is a perception. It's something we teach in schools, right? That those people who hate us are those individuals from the outside, not from the inside. But as we start to continue, especially since 9/11, we start to see that there's many more internal threats than there are external threats. We're also starting to see religious motivation, okay? When we look at, for example, far right movements, again, far right is not someone who is basically conservative, those kinds of things. We're talking about extreme far right, and we could talk about extreme far left too. And don't get me wrong on this. They tend to be very religiously motivated. In fact, we could look at far right and far left groups, and we can see a Christian motivation in both, okay? Small scale and outside the US, that's what we assumed. We assumed that they only attacked military installations, but as we can see with 9/11 from external threats, when we can see the federal building in Oklahoma in the early 2000s, we can see it's an internal threat. Those were not military institutions, okay? And we're seeing, since we're kind of taking the blinders off, that there is an increase in domestic terrorism. And this is where I make the argument. There is not an increase in domestic terrorism. There has always been domestic terrorism when we look at what we've done to minority groups in the United States. The way that we see it, though, since 9/11 is we're starting to see those things as forms of terrorism, okay? And then we also need to recognize a changing American population as it feeds in this. I've said this for about the last 10, 20 years. White America is becoming the minority, and the minority populations in the United States are becoming the majority. And when we see the right, again, that right white supremacist view in increasing in the United States, it's because of this continued threat that we see. And then we have to look at mass media and social media and see how we feed in it. On the mass media end, we have to recognize that mass media feeds on ratings. It doesn't necessarily feed on facts and those types of things. It feeds on what's getting ratings for advertisers. And so they're going to put out that narrative that appeals to those individuals who do that. And I say that, I don't mean disrespect. If you want an opinion from an expert, if you really want to watch the news, watch CNN, watch Fox News, watch MSNBC, watch CBS, and come to your own conclusion. Okay. And then we got to recognize social media's role in this, and that social media has its own goals. It doesn't care whether you're interacting with your fellow friends or people who challenge you. It's looking at you as what will get you to their advertisers, what will feed you to continue to come back to their platform over and over and over. And a lot of times those are those things that feed into our anger and our frustration and our view of the world. And if we're liberalist, it will feed into that liberal mindset. If we're conservatives, it will feed into that conservative mindset, because it knows by providing individuals with that information, it will make it so that you are on that platform more and more and more often. Okay. So now let's start with the bottom-up process. So analyzing the terrorists. So what are some psychological vulnerabilities? So those are some what we've been talking about are some generalizations about socializations and those kinds of things. But let's talk about the individual level. What are some vulnerabilities that would put someone susceptible to these kinds of actions? So we can look at factors point to some having greater openness to increased engagement or the need for that, and makes them more vulnerable to others engaging in terrorism. And situational and context factors affect whether psychological characteristics and propensity manifest. So what are some of these situational and contextual factors? Okay. This is where, and again, when I mentioned the Unabombers that were the bombers that walk into places and explode themselves, I can't remember the short name for it, is what we find is they come from what would seem like good families, good education, good this, but what they're needing is meaning and identity in their life. So what they're seeking a quest for, or what they're driven for four things. One is a sense of purpose. One comes to believe one's actions and activities make a difference and affect the outcomes of the future events. Okay. And if you think about that, if you think about individuals who are in that well-to-do area, they have made some differences, right? They've gotten their education, they have a stable family, so they feel like they can affect the outcome of future events. Okay. Efficacy, feeling of efficacy comes from one's sense of control over the basic directions and outcomes of one's life. So having a sense that I control my life, not out of control, which a lot of people would assume a terrorist would have. It's that actual belief that I have control over myself and my destiny. And then there's value. Sense of value comes from beliefs and one's actions are good and correct in a moral sense. And this is why I think we see an increase in religious-based terrorist groups, is this idea that my moral sense is the right direction and the way to go. And then we see individuals who have a very well self-worth. Self-worth comes from a sense of person's fundamental good and possesses desirable characteristics. Okay. And again, when we go back to Al-Qaeda, we go back to the individuals who were in that, we go back to not Osama bin Laden. Yeah, bin Laden. Okay, he came from a well-to-do family, well-educated, good sense of faith. So he had a sense of purpose. He believed in his efficacy and his values, and he had a high sense of self-worth. Okay, those are the ingredients that can start to drive this quest towards aiming towards some of these extremist or fundamentalist groups. Fulfilling these needs is a foundation of a sense of personal identity. I need to prove these things to the world. And people gravitate towards an existing structural set of beliefs to adopt with little critical thought. So individuals who have these things gravitate towards those things that already have a structure in place. I will admit, I worry about this with higher education, because every time we say we need to implement a new process, what do? We say, well, let's go look at all of the other colleges and see what they do and just copy what they do. And from my perspective, studying all this stuff, I think that's a bad direction to head. An institution should look at their student body, their population, and do what's best for them, not necessarily what some other college from some other place is doing because it worked for them. And that's kind of the idea behind this, okay? Not at that level, but that's kind of what they're doing. And so what we're seeing in higher education is a homogenization of education, to where students don't actually get the diversity of education that they once got, because everyone is just copying everyone else. Okay. All right, extremist ideology is often attractive to those who feel overwhelmed by the complexity and stress of finding meaning. So these individuals have these abilities, but these abilities are also stressful. Okay. They're stressful in the sense that they become overwhelming. So that ideology that gives a very basic understanding relieves that stress and anxiety to that individual. And then we come to an area of my study, the need for belonging, loneliness, those kinds of things. And we see other processes that go along with that. Again, people quest for a meaning that needs a sense of belonging, a sense of inclusion, okay? If a person has been rejected or excluded, they're more likely to endorse ideas about futility and lack of meaning in life. That's not necessarily what extremist groups provide, though. They can provide a path to lessen that anxiety and that stress. Creates a psychological vulnerability to exploitation, and that's what that statement meant. Social process is important. Initial attraction is often to the group or community of believers rather than an abstract ideology or to violence. I think about this on a less conflictual kind of thing, is flat earthers, okay? So people who believe the earth is flat. When we go analyze flat earth believers, and let's say we go visit one of their 2-day conferences, okay? In that conference, what you will find is that maybe a half a day out of those 2 days, maybe 5 hours of that 2-day experience is talking about the justification of why the world is flat. 3/4 of that time or more is spent with you interacting with people you think are like you. And that's what attracts people to the flat earth, not the argument, not the idea that the earth is flat, but that there are people who you can affiliate with because you don't have a place, maybe you're feeling confused about your world. You have all of these intellectual abilities and all these things, but because you don't have a place, you're attracted to that group, okay? And so that starts that process. And then I'm going to end with this today, and I've taken down the questions that are being asked in the group. And Angel, I'm going to get to these, but I do need to end with this slide right here, is the perception of injustice or humiliation, okay? Perceived injustice and humiliation as a center factor of understanding violence generally and terrorism specifically. And there's 3 factors of injustice as accelerators. So a lot of times people who are looking for that place, they look at the world as being unjust. And they're feeling a sense of humiliation, that they are not being put into the place where they feel they belong. And this is the thing, people are naturally included to view injustice as an intentional act. And this comes from the just world perspective. People get what they deserve and deserve what they get. And so if we view a person as being unjust, we view them doing that intentionally. And it is our job to bring about a just world. If people find a victim of injustice, then they assume someone else is at fault for that condition. They don't blame themselves. They attribute the blame now as a target. And I'll bring this up. I brought this up in this class again over and over when Donald Trump was appealing to far right-wing conspiracists, when he said that the Mexicans are bringing the rapists, the drugs, the crime across the border. Okay, this is what this means. They find themselves as victims of the injustice, even though they're the ones who are committing the crimes, ingesting the drugs, and doing the fraud. They have to attribute that blame to a different target because they see themselves as the moral people. And then for tonight, I'm going to end with this. Ways in which people process social information largely is driven by clarity and strengths of injustice sentiment. So the more people feel a notion between justice, remember when we go back, these often are individuals who are into black and white thinking. There's right and there's wrong. And the further wrong you are, the more evil you are. And therefore, the more correction that needs to be put in place. Okay, gang, I apologize. It's getting near 6:30. I can't take many questions. I do have what was put